America just captured and brought to justice the dictator of Venezuela. But what about some of the other hostile powers that were aligned with the Maduro regime? In the wake of not just the recent action in Caracas, but also the U.S. and Israeli strikes that took out the Iranian nuclear program, the Israeli defeats of Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, one of the key strategic questions that thinkers in Washington and Jerusalem are asking is, where does Turkey and its Islamist government led by Recep Erdoğan stand now? Is it an enemy that seeks regional hegemony, that supports rogue regimes like Maduro and Hamas, or a friend and NATO ally of the United States? Or is it both of those things? Today, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the question of Turkey and its place in the Middle East in the age of Donald Trump. Welcome to Think Twice. Today we have an important conversation for you with scholar Mark Meirowitz about Turkey and its equivocal role in the Middle East. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now to today's program. The leader of any country with hostile intentions towards the West and the United States rests entirely easy after what just happened in Venezuela. One of those nations that had good relations with the Maduro regime was that of Turkey, which has also been an avid supporter of Hamas, Hezbollah, and anti-Indian terrorists in Kashmir, and a vicious critic of Israel. But the Islamist government, led by President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, also plays a double game. A member of NATO, Erdogan has also at times tried to cultivate good relations with the United States under both Barack Obama and Donald Trump. And he shares an interest with the Trump administration in promoting the new government of Syria, led by former jihadis. And Turkey also has an equivocal relationship with Iran and its terrorist network, in which they are rivals but share a common interest in suppressing their Kurdish populations by brutal means. As Israel and the United States seek to force Hamas to disarm and to ensure that Iran doesn't try to rebuild its missiles and nuclear program, the question of where Turkey fits into this puzzle is important to understanding what will happen next. To discuss this, we're pleased to have with us a leading scholar on Turkey. Mark Meirowitz is a professor at the Maritime College of the State University of New York. He's an expert in Turkish foreign policy, U.S. Turkish relations, and Turkish-Israeli relations. He teaches American history, American foreign policy, constitutional law, English and the Holocaust, as well as ocean politics and the law. He has written extensively on these subjects and appears in the U.S. and international media as a commentator on issues related to international relations and U.S. domestic politics. Mark Meirowitz, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you very much. Great privilege to be with you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you. Professor Meirowitz, thanks for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the story we're all discussing this week, which is the U.S. capture of Venezuela's Marxist dictator, Nicolas Maduro. Where did Turkey, you're the expert on Turkey, where did Turkey stand with respect to the regime in Caracas? And what did that say about the equivocal role it plays in international relations, not just in the Middle East, but around the world?
Well, I can tell you I've been spending the last couple of days doing interviews on Venezuela and trying to explain to the world how our rule of law works here. And I believe, based on what I see on Twitter and elsewhere, and what I've been reading, that Maduro had a very close relationship with President Erdogan. And in fact, I think he was offered an out to go to Turkey and just, live in peace. Now, there is a very funny note on Twitter, or X, if you will, that's kind of funny, where someone says that Maduro had the offer to go to Turkey, and then he said, well, what's the inflation rate? And he was told it's 50%. And he said, you know what? And I'd rather go to prison in the United States than lose all my money and go to Turkey. Now, that may be apocryphal or not, but it does say a lot.
Probably, but it's one of those things. Maybe, if you didn't say it, maybe you should have.
It tells you a lot about the thinking here. I think the takeaway on this is, President Erdogan has also issued a number of statements on Venezuela, indicating his solidarity with Maduro and commenting negatively on the United States' action in seizing him and taking him back to the United States. We say in the law, I'm also a lawyer, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. What is this alliance or friendship between Maduro and Erdogan? I mean, look, Erdogan had many interesting friends and alliances, and those hopefully, my idea about this was that when the United States went in, those Cuban agents and the others, the Cubans provided security for Maduro. I actually am friendly with a former United Nations ambassador to Venezuela before Chavez. And, one thing that he had remarked to me some years ago was he's got Cuban intelligence, Cuban security. So these rogue nations, Cuba and China and Russia and Hezbollah and these others and Iran are in there. And it shows just how, this intervention, that's the intervention that's the problem, not the intervention of the United States in taking Maduro back and having him stand trial. But the symbiosis and attachment, as you asked, with Erdogan is, as I say, it's perplexing, but also problematic, certainly.
Yeah, I guess my question is, does Turkey have good relations with, sort of a rogue regime in South America just because it upsets the United States, or just because, that's what all these, transgressive regimes do? They all kind of link together. They're all very different. Venezuela, the Maduro regime is, sort of Marxist, narco-terrorist regime. Turkey is an Islamist, is run by Islamists. You would ask, what do they have in common? But somehow, what makes those two strange bedfellows wind up together at times?
Well, I'm not really in a position to drill down to the answer specifically, but I'll tell you what I think. I think a lot of this has to do with Turkey's desire to extend its reach beyond Turkey itself, because Erdogan has always said Turkey is greater than Turkey itself. And he has expanded the influence of Turkey to many other continents, very significantly into Africa, Somalia, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit, in Somaliland. Very interesting, very important, very strategic. Libya, Eastern Med, you name it, but also into South America and Europe. Turkey itself is a state that has both European and Asian geographical components. So I think it's a lot about that. I don't know that it's really about what you call transgressive regimes partnering up. I think it's really about Turkey's defense industry and selling its products and business and trade, and the enormous amount of trade that Turkey does with the rest of the world. But it also has expanded really geometrically its consular offices around the world and its impact around the world. So no question that Turkey is not at least satisfied in being just a local or even a regional power. I think that's more of it. I'd have to see more about the specifics of Venezuela, which I simply don't know in depth to tell you right now to opine on that.
Well, let's back up for a moment. And who is, for our audience, who really is, President Erdogan? Where did he come from? He's been in power, I believe, for 22 years, first as prime minister and then as president of Turkey. And why is Turkey led by Islamists after nearly a century of being a secular nation? And how has this affected its place in U.S. and Israeli foreign policy?
Well, I think it's a more complex question. Erdogan was an activist. He He was jailed. Has a rough and tumble background. He was a top soccer player or football player, as they call it in Turkey. Where I think he comes from and where he's at is really more about the perception the Turks have about Turkey than these other factors. Obviously, there's many other factors and geopolitical issues and other factors affecting Israel, the region, Europe, EU, NATO, the United States, and on and on. But as I see it, Turkey has always been looked down upon, to be very candid. It was called the sick man of Europe.
Right.
And, to be very candid, I mean, Turks didn't really get a lot of love and respect from the rest of the world. Of course, it had a lot to do with the Ottoman Empire and the attitudes of even the Arabs. I know I have a very close friend, Turkish-Israeli, he says, Mark, the Arabs never liked the Ottomans. I mean, there was a certain amount of, sentiment, which is engendered
let me
by
jump
the
in
empire.
there and ask you, one of the things, that those of us who sort of follow it lightly, is that Erdogan has ambitions of, if not reassembling the Ottoman Empire, which once, extended across the Middle East and into North Africa, but at least, that is his driving motivation, is to at least get the respect back that he sees Turkey as this central power in the Middle East, the Islamic world, as the Ottomans once were, and then of course they went into decline, in the 18th, 19th century and became the sick man of Europe. Once they were, at the gates of Vienna. Does everyone really want to be, the caliph, the sultan, the inheritor of the conqueror who took Constantinople, or is it something, is that exaggerated?
I'm not so sure. I wanted to just clarify further my idea about Turkey and the perception of Turks. I think it is very clear that what Erdogan has accomplished for the people of Turkey is to put Turkey on the map of the world. I mean, after all, Finland, Sweden wanted to be in NATO. You have to come to President Erdogan and ask for permission to do that. And many other, the Ukraine war, well, there's a Lausanne, there's a convention on the Bosporus, and that is, Turkey controls the access to the straits, and they actually created a very important decision in terms of Russian ships being able to traverse the Bosporus and taking grain out of the Black Sea. And being a mediator and being a pivotal player, which can talk about. President Erdogan wants to be on Gaza now as well. But what I'm trying to point out is that it's a matter of pride. The way I see the election that Erdogan won, which the pundits, particularly the Turkish commentators here in the United States, were almost like with President Trump as, he's going to lose. He doesn't have support. Wrong. You read that wrong. The point was that the perception is changed in the Turkish mind. We are a player on the world scene now. The world is coming to us, President Erdogan, and asking us to be part of coalitions, we're NATO power. We're a player on the world scene, which previously, this is quite apart from achieving the Ottoman Empire again. That's what I'm saying. I think it has a lot to do with being at the center of, I know we're talking about it, and people are talking about it all the time. And they have been, and Erdogan has made it a source of self-respect and pride. I always say that when Turks do a toast, when Jews do a toast, they say l'chaim, to life. The toast in Turkish is sherifeh, to our pride, to our pride. And it's a very important thing to understand how the world really just kind of ignored Turkey's thinking, Turkey's importance. And now they're very, very important. No, as Turkey should be, as a regional player, as an important political player, and in the halcyon days of relationship with Israel, was forming a very important alliance, which was very beneficial to both powers. And I hope it'll come back one day, God willing. But in the meantime, it's important to realize that Turkey on many fronts plays an important role. And I think that is the one thing to focus on, apart from the thinking about the other points that you raised, which may have validity. But right now, I think what Erdogan has achieved for Turkey is being a significant player in the world scene. And I think that's indisputable. What it means or how it progresses is a matter of further discussion and debate.
Well, I think that's clearly true. And Turkey is, it's a fact. It's a big country. Let's, dive a little bit more into it. I think the perception is that, it's also an Islamist country, and that the AKP, Erdogan's party, it is, a religious party. By them taking power, Turkey sort of shifted from secularism, and that, obviously that had to have an impact on its relations with Israel. How brutal, how brutal a regime is it? Obviously, there has, been fighting with the Kurds. How does it treat national minorities? I mean, it still argues about whether, Turkey committed genocide against the Armenians. Is this just a matter of national pride? We don't want to be considered, the Middle East Nazis, or what's at the heart of this?
And if you look at Turkey today and people who go in here who become tourists there, you'd be very surprised to see, it's always that image of, the two young girls walking together, one in jeans and a modern outfit and the other in a headscarf. And that's the thing that you do see in Turkey. It's a society which has produced academics and scholars. And of course, it's a society that produced Ataturk, who was definitely an innovator, who brought in, people should have social dancing and, take away the fez and, have a new alphabet and all kinds of things.
He was the founder of modern Turkey, the Turkish Republic that succeeded the Ottomans.
And there's still many Turks who live by this. I have a very good friend, and he always talks about, that child was just born as a child of Ataturk. And there's still many Turks around the world who respect Ataturk. So it isn't just a monochromatic vision of what's going on here. It's very, very complicated. You are right that the internal political squabbles, internal political, dissension is very problematic. In particular, the Republican People's Party, the AK Party, the numerous parties. It's a very problematic and very roller coaster. That's the best way I could describe following Turkish politics, is kind of wake up in the morning and trying to understand what happened today and what's the latest exciting event that has occurred. We've had coups in Turkey, the recent coup in July 2016, which is now memorialized in what's called Democracy and Unity Day. It's a national holiday.
Explain to us what happened there. And that wasn't the first time that, apparently there was an attempt, or Erdogan says there was an attempt to overthrow him. Who wants to overthrow him? And, how popular, how strong is Erdogan's support against these efforts?
Well, that would take us an entire course of a semester.
Well, as we say in our tradition, on one foot.
Exactly. That is exactly right. That's very funny. I think that you've had a number of factions internally fighting against other factions. And, the Gülenists were in league with AK Party, and the Gülenists were then purged. The army was purged. The number of the coups that occurred previously involved the military rising up. This one, again, from the friends of mine who told me about it, told me it absolutely positively took place. And there was a faction that wanted to take power. And Erdogan, what the story, of course, is that what happened, the coup plotters were coming after him. He was on a plane. He had his phone. He called into the radio, a TV station, asking people to go to the bridge and fight the coup plotters. And they fought. And and I think that's the story of the coup. The coup was suppressed by the people. And then Erdogan essentially purged, the people accused of plotting the coup. That is what has happened in Turkey. Now, Turkey is a complicated political landscape. Its internal politics is highly fraught, highly complicated. We have an executive system now, which we used to have a parliamentary system that was amended in a constitutional amendment. There may be another constitutional amendment.
And that gave Erdogan more power.
Essentially, yes. And now, in order for President Erdogan to run again, because he's term limited, there has to be another amendment to the Constitution or early elections, because he has served 2 terms and he would be up in 2028. So when you're asking me to ride the roller coaster with you to tell you what is coming up in Turkey, that is a complicated question also in terms of opposition parties and how the opposition parties have been treated. I should mention the Kurds for a moment because it's important, really important to talk about that as well, because if there is an issue in Turkey that is, at least I would say, in most views, in most parties and most people in Turkey are united on this issue on the Kurds. Of course, there are a few millions of Kurds living in, I think it's about 15 million, living in Turkey. But there's a terrorist group called PKK. And now there's a peace process going on with the PKK, with their leader, who is on an island, who was arrested some years ago, and to try to work out a peace process so that this group will put their arms down. But no story in Turkey is just simplistic in that this relates directly to what goes on in Syria with the Syrian Kurds. And this issue is of central significance, not only to Turkish politics, but to Turkish psyche. The fear the Kurds will create a separate state or statelet in Syria, and the worry about that is pervasive even across all parties. So when you said before about the fighting with the Kurds, I mean, now you might say to me, and if you want to, and take my political scientist hat, put it on, I might say, well, President Erdogan needs the votes of the Kurdish members of parliament in order to get an amendment to the Constitution in order to run again. Now, that's all politics is local. That famous Turkish politician, Tip O'Neill, he said that, and he was right. And it applies very, very differently in Turkey, in the sense that a lot of the moving parts that you see here also relate to how the AK Party wants to maintain its continuous existence, and President Erdogan continuing to be in power, although there is discussion going on in terms of succession and who might succeed him. All these discussions going on all at the same time. So let me put it this way. There's no calm moment, and no moment when you just sit back and say, well, I can just sit back and nothing will ever happen, because every day something happens. And even with Israel, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that it's kind of this poem about the worm turning around. The worm turned around completely. We had incredible development of relations, and then suddenly we have a complete disaster in those relations. And similarly, in Turkish-U.S. relations, we have had very good times and bad times. In Biden, we had very poor relations. Trump seems to be more amenable to President Erdogan. So it's hard to kind of wrap around where we are and what does it all mean and where is it all going. That really is a step-by-step, a very careful step-by-step analysis. I don't know if that really addressed what you were saying, but I'm just saying that it's very hard to answer these questions because of uncertainty in how the Turkish system and politics will respond to particular issues. Like the Venezuela thing that we started with. I mean, each thing presents yet another puzzling aspect of this to try to understand it and make it clear. And it's really, I always say, Steve Kinzer has a book on Turkey, and in there, in the introduction, he says to understand Turkey is like understanding Rocky. I don't know if you're familiar with that national drink, and it's a very popular. I think it's similar to Israeli Arak. You pour it, says Kinzer, and it's clear. But you add water, that's how you use it, and it becomes murky. That's Turkey. You look at the glass, it's completely clear, you think you get it, add the water, now it's murky, and you're absolutely puzzled. So I
Interesting metaphor.
I summarize understanding Turkey.
Well, let's talk a bit about U.S. Turkish relations. You're right. Relations were bad with the Biden administration, but before that, at least for a time, I mean, Barack Obama spoke of Erdogan as his favorite foreign leader, which, a lot of critics of Obama didn't think speak well for him. But now again, Trump, seems to like Erdogan, or at least thinks he can do business with him. What's driving the nature of U.S., the ups and downs, the rising and falling stock of U.S.-Turkish relations? What are the points of contention, and how is Erdogan at times, being able to cozy up to whoever's in the White House?
I'm going to go back to your first question because I think it's really important. Look at what's happening in Venezuela, and I'd like to start with that because our national security strategy that came out said the United States is focusing on the Western Hemisphere. Now, that was very important for me because what that means is, the president cannot be, cooking multiple meals at the same time, or we say dancing on many weddings or chasanas, right? Can't do that. He's focusing on Venezuela. He does not. And Ukraine is there, and he's trying to solve that one. Wow, that's so difficult to solve. He does not want another war in the Middle East. He does not want a war between Turkey and Israel. He does not want a war in Syria, although I would say if you're looking at the crystal ball, it doesn't look good in terms of Syria. It's not a good picture, very worrisome picture. I've said it since the beginning, since al-Shara took power. We're a train wreck to war. Somehow, God forbid, but it doesn't look good. So this is Trump. When Trump meets with Erdogan in the White House, right, his attitude is, and even with al-Shara from Syria, his attitude is, great guy. Or with al-Shara, he says, oh, he's a young man, he's a fighter. Or when he meets with the new mayor, he's wonderful, this guy's wonderful. He doesn't want to start fights and conflicts. He wants to have some sort of I can't call it pacifying this issue, but...
Well, he wants a connection. He wants to start a dialogue.
But I think, Jonathan, the other point is he has outsourced a lot of this, not to the State Department, because, Turkish diplomats tell me, the State Department, we try to reach them. There's nobody. They've downsized. There aren't people there. So it's Tom Barrack. Tom Barrack, who's the ambassador, who is a very close friend like Steve Witkoff.
The United States ambassador to Turkey.
Yes, to Turkey as a special envoy to Syria, or Steve Witkoff involved in these other issues, important issues. He's outsourced these issues to these confidants, which is not unheard of in American politics, where you trust your friend and you have them. But we see problems in doing that because these envoys are not, skilled enough or create problems or kerfuffles in the relations with Israel, with Syria, with Turkey. So if you ask me, how is the relationship between Turkey and the United States? Well, if you're looking at the Oval Office and you're looking at President Erdogan visiting there, the Turks have been very gratified and very happy with the reaction. But if you look at that only, you're not looking at Congress. You have to look at Congress. And this is one thing I've always said. Elites in this country don't understand Turkey. Elites in Turkey definitely don't understand the American system. They think, because you mentioned Barack Obama, same issue. President Erdogan would go meet with Obama. He'd have a wonderful meeting. But in Congress, the lobbies in Congress who oppose Turkey are very, very active. They've been around for a long time, right? And they oppose, for example, the current issue, which is Turkey wanting to get the F-35 again. Turkey was thrown out of the F-35 program because it acquired the S-400 from Russia. Now, it's very interesting because this relates to the use of the F-35s. Again, I mentioned Venezuela and also Iran. F-35 is an incredible fighter, but it's also a data center. And it is very powerful. And if it's used with the S-400, right, it would give the capacity to take information and give it over potentially to our adversaries. And that's why the United States and Iran in particular and others, the United States does not want to give the F-35 to Turkey so long as it has the S-400. Senator Jim Risch, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, in the nomination hearing with Tom Barrack, said, so long as I'm here in this committee, Turkey will not get the F-35, so long as they have the S-400. They're not going to get it. So
that goes, to the question, like, what are the points of contention? The point, clearly, perception in Washington, based on things like them having Russian planes, is that they play both ends against the middle. They're in NATO, but they don't act like an ally, or at least Americans don't perceive them to be acting like an ally. They're acting at times like they're another Middle Eastern country, hostile to Israel, friendly to our enemies, and they're sort of frenemies. Now like Qatar, frenemies can be very popular in the White House, but that's not necessarily going to be very popular among Americans in general, or at least those Americans who care about foreign policy.
Well, it wasn't always like that. I mean, in other words, before October 7th, if you look back a little bit, you'll see that, in fact, and I know this myself from personal interaction and saw this, President Erdogan was going to go to Israel. He invited President Netanyahu to come and meet with him. He had Herzog, but he was going to go to Israel. And then October 7th came. And then the world completely changed and collapsed, also for Israel and for the Jewish people in many respects. But, where were we? And I think if you look back even at that time, the potential there of Turkey being an energy hub, working with Israel with its resources, that was a real possibility. That was what was being discussed. Now that's gone. And now you see a morphing into Greece and the Greek Cyprus and Israel getting a tripartite agreement to create a SWAT team, an immediate response force. And Turkey could have easily avoided that, because had they made that foray into better relations, which is where we were going in September 2023, they could have even broken that Eastern Mediterranean Forum, which was a raid against Turkey and its exploration Eastern Mediterranean. If you remember, that was the one issue that they were united on. Turkey cannot take resources in the East. And there was the Piri Reis, Turkish ship, all these powers, Greece and Israel, Cyprus and others. And then there was going to be an agreement on energy with Israel. Now, that's gone. So I think it was a cost-benefit analysis, I think, that Turkey made on this. And I think they made the wrong choice, clearly the wrong choice. No doubt about it.
Was it just that they have to be aligned against Israel as long as Israel is fighting Hamas? Erdogan is a big supporter of Hamas, always has been. You spoke of the sort of reconciliation between Israel and Turkey before October 7th. But that was, recovering relations after Turkey's, supporting of efforts to break, the Egyptian and Israeli blockade of Gaza, the Turkish ship that Israel had to board to, and then people were killed because of the conflict, and that turned into an international incident. But of course, it wasn't just about a ship; it was about, Turkey supporting Hamas.
Well, the Mavi Marmara is very important to talk about, because that was first of all, the relations were gone, right, pretty much, but trade continued. Trade continued throughout the period at a pretty good level, not a great level, between Israel and Turkey. And then you might remember there were these conditions. There was an apology was given on the tarmac with Obama, Netanyahu said, I'm sorry, and all this. A couple of things were done, and things looked better. Now, but trade continued. We're seeing something different now. Now, by the way, there were halcyon days, having known Israeli diplomats who served in, Israelis who served in Turkey for Israeli diplomacy. I mean, they couldn't speak.
Well, Turkey was a go-to place for Israeli tourists.
You might remember that El Al was complaining that Turkish Airlines was getting, all the passengers who are going to Israel via Turkish Airlines and not going El Al. I mean, how crazy does that sound today when we're thinking about the fact that there are, embargoes and boycotts? I think that, the Hamas issue obviously is a terrible issue and inexcusable, and there's no excuse for the support of Hamas, so that we can just put that aside for the moment. But whether this represents some sort of a strategic or some sort of a strategic purpose here, more so the ideological purpose, I'm not sure. I think about it all the time because it's so disturbing, the idea of the support of Hamas against Israel. It's inexcusable, and there's no defense for it, but it's obviously was a recurring issue even throughout the entire period that I described, even through the period of where the relations were pretty much in a stability mode. But obviously October 7th is the watershed that could not be overcome. And, as they say, two roads diverged in the wood, and Turkey took the one road, and now a collapse completely, and a lot of the rhetoric back and forth between, Israel and, listening to Amichai Chikli, in Israel, talking about, Turkey and, close the consulate and, all these things is, in a way, if you think about it, the inevitable result of this disastrous situation. Is absolutely disastrous. The only one maybe who can put Humpty Dumpty back together is Trump, to get them together, somehow, even in a détente. I'm not talking about an entente. I would love an entente again, because we had it. We had military cooperation with Israel, providing military equipment to Turkey. Absolutely. Détente, to get them at least to dampen down the rhetoric, because these are the two countries in the region that really are standing up. Israel, Turkey. I mean, who else in the region? Iran, of course, is the malevolent power, hopefully now declining, that really is I don't know if is it a frenemy, a friend? I don't know, to Turkey. It's a little hard to understand.
Well, I wanted to ask about that specifically.
Yeah, but as Iran goes down, Turkey goes up. I mean, but as I said, the only one who really can put them together is Trump, but Trump is distracted, constantly distracted by trying to do all the things he wants to accomplish during his tenure as president. And particularly this Venezuela thing is going to take his energy, right? A lot of his energy. So as I said before, he's outsourcing it to these people who really very often cause more problems. And then, as they start fires that they have to be put out, like Barak in Syria, which is causing unbelievable problems for Israel and unbelievable problems and in terms of Gaza, because Turkey wanted to be in the rehabilitation force in Gaza and have troops and in southern Syria, near Israel. I mean, this presents the next dimension of a Middle East crisis, and that has to be deconflicted. It has to be completely repaired ASAP, and President of the United States is the only one that really can do it and needs to do it, and needs to be not distracted and maybe not even listening so much to Barak and trying to figure out what to do. And I think he can do it because he has good relationships with both Netanyahu and Erdogan. But, if it continues this way, in this direction, I think it's worrisome. I think I'm quite worried.
Well, let me back up for a minute, because, you've traced for us that, sort of relations with Israel and Turkey have gone up and down. And October 7th was the point where sort of the up and down stopped and it just stayed down.
Right, exactly.
But is it fair, I mean, when you mentioned Amichai Chikli, who is a member of Netanyahu's government, in the perception of many people in Israel, and indeed some in the United States, is that a Turkey led by Erdogan and the AKP and basically an Islamist party, weren't they always going to revert to anti-Israel rhetoric, because that's at the heart of their identity. I mean, was it ever realistic? Is it realistic to think that Erdogan will ever really be comfortable with good relations with Israel? I mean, isn't basically a ceasefire about as good as it could ever really be?
Well, this is why I say that he says ceasefire, I say détente, You say tomato, I say tomato. It's the same thing. I mean, they have to stop what they're doing, without obviously supporting Hamas, supporting terror. It's just impossible to accept it. And it's ridiculous, horrible. I think that the world has changed so much over the past period of time. I mean, that I'm going to remain a cautious optimist that somehow we'll get back at least to this détente and stop this. But on the other hand, I would say, being a realist about it, I mean, the whole Gaza situation in the minds of Turks in particular, I'm not talking about the Arab world, the minds of Turks, has been very much become pervasive. And so supposing tomorrow it changed, right? There's going to be a change. I just don't know how you unring that bell in terms of saying, okay, today now we're going to be good friends with Israel, when the whole idea of this whole mantra, which is all around the world, about Gaza and Palestine, and there's particularly...
which Erdogan has been feeding himself.
That's right. And so it is of a point where it's hard to say that you can reverse it. And that's concerning. It's highly concerning. Because there are highly educated people in Turkey. There are highly accomplished people in Turkey. But, one does see, even in academic meetings and things that I will hear, this mantra repeated as if it were, the quote-unquote gospel truth. This Gaza, free Palestine, genocide, and all these words become accepted of the nomenclature, even among experts and academics. And it's acceptable rhetoric in parlance among certain groups in society. You can't unring that bell and just say tomorrow things are going to be fine. And now this guy who I told you all these things about today is a great guy. He's a really good guy. And that is, and I'm hoping that we haven't reached a point of no return on that. Because at some point in time, the Gaza situation somehow will, be in the past. And then something's maybe there'll be a rehabilitation. Of course, we have to overcome the issue of whether or not Turkish infrastructure and Turkish troops are going to be in Gaza. We haven't overcome that. Israel has said no.
I find that hard to believe that Israel would ever go along with that.
No, I was saying that whether the United States would press Israel to accept that and make that happen, that would be extremely problematic. I'm not saying that it should happen, certainly not. But I'm saying that assuming that the whole Gaza situation, what occurred in Gaza, is in the rearview mirror, and we're going forward, driving forward, can we drive forward without having that as a burden in thinking and having that as a continuous burden? And I don't know how you do that, particularly in Turkish society and all levels of Turkish society. I think it also relates to the future political developments in Turkey, Jonathan, where we don't know who the leadership is going to be. Is it going to be Erdogan serving on to another term? Is it going to be successors? What is the resolution of the internal issues in terms of opposition parties? All of these are imponderables, and also Syria and the Kurds in in Turkey and in Syria. I mean, there are a lot of very big obstacles in the way of a clear future for Turkey.
Well, let me ask you before we get to, because I want to ask specifically about Turkey's role in Syria, and then get to Somaliland as well briefly. And it's an imponderable, as you just said, but obviously, just as Netanyahu doesn't seem to believe in successors, although, he has to face elections and, he may or may not be reelected next year. Erdogan someday will be succeeded. What are the prospects? As hard as it is to figure it out, is he likely to be succeeded by someone who shares his views on, sort of Turkey's role in the Middle East and the world? Is there a possibility of sort of non-Islamists ever, winning back power? Is that realistic?
Well, the main contenders is kind of funny because it's sort of similar to U.S. Here we're looking at Eric Trump and Don Jr., and there you have the son and the sons-in-law, one of whom is Bayraktar, who is the genius of the drones, the drone guy, very popular. And the other contender is Hakan Fidan, who is the foreign minister of Turkey. Yes, there definitely is talk about this succession. It depends who it is. I don't think that even if it were the son or sons-in-law, and certainly not Fidan. Fidan is a very, very accomplished, experienced diplomat who intelligence, foreign policy. So that could be something. I'm not sure, but that one is something different. The others, hard to know. I think it's more about building up Turkey's defense industry, building up its economy. I mean, it has a real economic crisis underway. The lira is so way down that, the economy is in deep, deep trouble. Whoever is going to come in has got to fix the economy. In the case of Turkey, it isn't necessarily economy stupid. It was, I want to be Turkey and I want to be proud. That's what it's about. But going forward for Turkey's future, the economy is a really big issue. A very good person in there, Mehmet Şimşek, who is a top. I had a chance to hear him at Bloomberg here in New York when he was here a number of years ago. He's well respected, but they like we have here. They fight over interest rates, between the president and the economic minister. So I think that like with Trump, and again, it's not a fair analogy, I'm sure. Trump, the strong MAGA, holding the MAGA flag going forward. Who's going to carry that? Very unlikely. Even Vance, it's very hard to carry the Trump flag going forward. There's one Trump. And I think in terms of Erdogan, there's one Erdogan, and will there be another Erdogan? I don't know, but unlikely to be the same combination. And you mentioned also and asked about his background. Someone with that background and combination, it just doesn't seem that way. These younger generation here, even his family, are more in business and more about, building business. And that's what I think they're going to focus on. But obviously, the internal dissension inside the political parties, inside the political system, is clearly problematic. And I don't know how you fix it. But I would say hopefully they can fix it, but it's going to continue to be a problem, whoever leads the country going forward, whether it's Erdogan. But if it's Erdogan, that's his vision. If it's these others, if they're the ones that are going to take over, I think it's going to be, let us say, a lesser intense version of it. Clearly.
Mm-hmm. Explain Syria's role, Turkey's role in Syria. They seem, they have an interest in preventing, an autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria, and obviously there's been fighting there. They've been part of that very complex, multi-party war that's went on there for so long. They seem to be supportive of the new, regime of the, ex-Al-Qaeda, guy Jalani. Trump seems to be willing to give that regime a chance. The Israelis are, I think, rightly very skeptical about Jalani. Where is Turkey where does Turkey fit into that puzzle? And are they, sort of a force to sort of for peace between Israel and Syria, or are they likely to be an irritant and to help stir things up?
Well, so if you're Turkey and you have 3+ million Syrian refugees, your main priority is to try to figure out a way to get them to go back home, to be able to, relieve the burden on the Turkish economy. Because when the Syrian refugees came in, they got jobs and healthcare. And, I didn't do a poll, but I think it's sort of not the same. But the same idea, these people come in and they, take jobs and do all this. And the Turks, they're not happy about it. So they want a stable Syria. And in order to have a stable Syria, the feeling is, and as I've heard it, the idea is if you have al-Jolani or al-Shara, and he's the go-to guy, and he can create a stable Syria, we're for him, right? He dresses nicely, he wears a nice outfit, he looks good, he sounds pragmatic. Let's go with him, okay? So that's number one. Number two is the Kurds, obviously, is a tremendous, I'll call it an obsession, but it's certainly an issue that the SDF, the Kurdish YPG, which Turkish government believes is affiliated with the PKK terrorists. The United States does not list the Syrian Kurds as terrorists on a terrorist list. We do list the PKK. So there's a divergence of opinion on that. They are hardened fighters. And here's the tricky part, because it's the Middle East, at the Kishon story with the frog and the scorpion. The Kurds have been fighting with American troops against ISIS. They're hardened fighters. They're great allies of the United States in fighting ISIS. There are ISIS prisons that the Kurds are maintaining. Yet at the same time, the Turks do not support the SDF as a separate existing entity. And what al-Shara has said was, and this was an agreement made among al-Shara and Muslim Abi, who's the Kurdish leader, that the Kurds would integrate their people into the Syrian forces. That has not happened. And the Turkish position is, well, if you don't integrate, if they want to break up the concentrated power of the Syrian defense forces of the Kurds, so that they won't remain a threat from Turkey's point of view to Turkey and to creating a Kurdish statelet, right? So now where we sit right now is the problem that Israel, right? Israel's position is it wants to support the minority groups, the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians, and others, a number of whom Alawites and Druze have been massacred, either directly or with the, wink, wink of the Syrian military. And, Barak, even our ambassador and others, and Turkey supports Turkey's position, want an integrated army, a military with just SDF, not separate, but in there integrated. This is an oil and water. This doesn't work well when you have foreign fighters, you even have Uyghurs, foreign jihadi fighters who are in there in the mix, in the soup of the Syrian army, and to get the Kurds integrated, very difficult. So there's a disconnect. I would also mention that Turkey's policy here is really focused. But if you want to focus on the Kurds, fine, on Israel, fine. It's on the stability of Syria. And the Turkish view is, if you don't integrate all the groups, and if you don't create a one Syria situation under one leader, you're going to have instability, and then it's going to collapse, and then we're going to get a few million more refugees. That's really what it's about. This is what they are worried about. They're also worried about Iran. We didn't talk about it, but they're very worried about Iran collapsing, because they're worried that if Iran collapses, they're going to get a few million refugees from Iran. So in other words, Turkey's interest is to keep a stable region. Even though one would see some of their policies as maybe arguably contributing to instability, they're really instability. That's why they're saying al-Shara is the go-to guy in Syria, should be one army, one al-Shara. Let's back him. which they did back him, by the way, when he had HTS. They backed him all the way back when he came into Syria, went to Idlib and fought the Assad regime. Turkey was supporting him. And they feel they've bet on the right guy. The problem with that is he's one person. They're putting, like they say in the casino, my bet on one horse, on one number. It's problematic. So Turkey's view here is multifaceted. The problem is they have a completely contrary position to Israel. And that is, again, a source of...
Yeah, that's a formula for conflict.
That's a formula for conflict. It has to be deconflicted, because what you don't want is God forbid, a conflict between Turkey and Israel or Syria and Israel. This is very difficult. Now, Israel has added to its buffer zone to Mount Hermon, and it needs, because it does not want to be overwhelmed again, like it was not having the buffer, having just a piece of cotton to protect us in Gaza. So there, the Syrian government has taken the view Israel must either get out, all right, or completely, or go back to the 74 disengagement. And so I don't know how that plays out, but that and the minorities in Syria is a completely different set of priorities than Turkey's priorities, because Turkey wants to come in and create infrastructure and have bases in Syria, even in the south.
And that would be something that obviously Israel would find highly problematic.
Again, a lot of red zones here, Jonathan, which we're looking at, and are radioactive issues. And the only one who can come in and be the, Merlin the wizard is the president, who can come in and say no, because also Turkey is a NATO power. Remember, Article 5 says if a NATO power is attacked, all NATO powers must come to their defense. Israel is not a NATO power. Or if God forbid you have a conflict between Israel and Turkey, you have a cataclysm of gigantic dimensions, and it must be avoided. So again, I look at Syria, I have to say, as a petri dish, I call it, where you have all of these different elements together, and trying to unsort them and fix them is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah. Briefly, you've already referenced, Turkish fears about Iran collapsing, but it has, at times very hostile, it has a rivalry, with the regime in Tehran as well. Explain, that equivocal relationship and, how that played out, in Syria, where Iran really, the Assad regime was Iran's, close ally. They helped save him for a long time during the civil war there. His collapse, undermined Iran, seemingly strengthened Turkey. How hostile are Turkey and Iran right now?
Well, the one thing just to mention before addressing that is that Al-Shara gave his interview to The Economist magazine, and he said, the Russians might be able to come back, and it's possible they might be it to get their bases again. Iran is never coming back into Syria, never. I would say it was best described to me by a Turkish diplomat. I mean, look, they have a border, a gigantically long border. They've been neighbors since time immemorial, and they've learned how to deal with each other. They're rivals, but at the same time, I think I have read, go back and check, I think President Erdogan had said something to the effect of Iran's interests are our interests, we support their interests. So, it's not a simple, again, of course, you do have Iran as a Shiite regime, and of course, Turkey is Sunni, and Syria is Sunni, and so forth. But at the same time, a very unusual relationship, in which, in some circumstances, Turkey has been supportive of Iran and its interests. But at the present time, I think it is fairly clear that as Iran goes down, Turkey goes up, in the sense that Iran's decline leaves a power vacuum, no question, which Turkey sees as possibly it can take advantage of. But again, we don't know yet what the end result is going to be in Iran. We don't know whether we have a collapse of the regime, or we just have another green revolution and we have a militia, clamping down on the people. But if that regime collapses, that'll be a big power vacuum in the region. And That's why I mentioned Somalia, because, that's an interesting thing. Because
that was my next question.
Yeah.
What is Syria's role in this conflict in Somalia? Where
Turkey's role?
Turkey's role there. Somaliland, which is sort of used to be British Somaliland.
Yes, that's right.
As opposed to Italian, the rest of Somalia was run by the Italians. They came together in independence, but the former British Somaliland broke away. It's now called Somaliland. Israel just recognized it. Nobody else seemingly does. What's Turkey doing there?
Well, Turkey has had longstanding relationships with Somalia. It has bases there. It has close relationships with them. So that has been part of their expansion, of their regional expansion into that area. But keep in mind that this Israel move is one of the most, it's remarkable. It's almost like it's out of the magic textbook, really, because there's a piece of land that sits right near the Houthis, right near the Red Sea, and once again shows that, again, in Syria, Israel, Turkey, diametrically different views. Somalia, right? Somaliland, Israel is a counter against Turkish expansionism. So, if you're Turkey and you see this, and, you see that this is your main counter, your main buffer, that also adds to the poor relationship between the two countries. I thought that Somaliland thing was like pulling, a rabbit out of a hat. That was just incredible move. But it also demonstrates the extraordinary hypocrisy of the world about recognizing a state. There, Somaliland's been around. It just didn't show up. It's actually a discrete area. It actually declared its own independence back in the 1990s. It's been around, and Israel recognized it. And these other high-flying people go, well, how can they do that? Are you kidding me? Well, these other countries recognize the Palestinian state, which has no boundary, has no government, has nothing, and everybody was exulting in the brilliance of that move. Besides the strategic brilliance of the move of recognizing Somaliland as a counter, and this was Israel's point, to Turkey's expanding influence and basis in Somalia. But this goes back a long time. Turkey's relationship with Somalia is a long-standing relationship, expanding. Now, the other is not only expanding in land, but also Turkey's expanse into maritime, because it also has these agreements for maritime zones with Libya, with, of course, with Turkish Cyprus, with other countries. So it's a strategic reach or strategic depth is something of great importance to Turkey. As we start with that, where Erdogan's view is that Turkey is greater than Turkey, if you will. He said that. So this is a kind of a concept. What that means or where it goes is not immediately clear to discern.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. Can you tell our audience how they can follow your work and where they can find out more about you?
Well, I'm on Twitter X at Bosporus Report, and I think that's a good way to follow me. And would love to be in touch with people. And if anybody's interested in further conversations, please let me know. It has been a tremendous pleasure and a privilege. And I told you, Jonathan, at the beginning, I've admired your work, and I thank you very much for the wonderful, insightful, and deep conversation on a really complicated issue that will merit a lot more discussion in the future, for sure.
Well, thank you, and thanks for joining us. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune into Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition every day, which you can follow on wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're watching us or listening to us on one of those, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, Keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.